The desert sun had not yet crested the horizon, but the base was already humming with the kind of quiet urgency only a military facility in the middle of nowhere could generate. Morning at Desert Ridge was a ritual, coffee in tin mugs, gravel crunching under boots, and the whine of machinery powering up in the distance. But on this morning, something was different. Something in the air felt heavier. The sand blew a little sharper against the skin, and the wind carried with it the sting of silence, like the calm before something that didn't yet have a name. In the maintenance shed on the far edge of the compound, Rowan Hale stood in front of a dead generator, its casing peeled open like a ribcage. Her hands moved with confidence, callous fingers tracing wires and contacts, checking voltages with a small, battered multimeter that looked older than some of the recruits. She worked without speaking, her jumpsuit tied around her waist, a faded tank top clinging to her back as sweat traced lines down her spine. A thin scar ran along her collarbone, half faded and almost poetic. She moved like someone used to being ignored but knew everything going on around her. That morning, like so many before it, she expected to work and be forgotten. She didn't expect to be seen. At 7:16, a commotion near the mess hall pulled half the base toward the main quad. Rowan didn't bother looking up until the sound of shouting broke through her concentration. Her head turned slowly, eyes narrowing as a soldier sprinted past the open bay door. Another one followed. Then a klaxon, short, sharp, not a drill. She stood, tool in hand, just as the alert repeated, base lockdown. All personnel report to designated shelter zones. Her stomach clenched, not in fear, but instinct. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. She knew this rhythm. She hadn't heard it in years, but it lived in her bones. She grabbed her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and ran. Not to the shelter zone, but toward the West Ridge perimeter. No one stopped her. Most didn't notice her. That was part of the reason she was still alive. That and the fact that she always knew where to look. As she reached the outer gate, a tremor shook the ground beneath her boots. Dust rose in a wave. The impact came seconds later. The sky behind the fuel depot blooming into fire and black smoke. Screams echoed. Rowan didn't stop. She dropped into a crouch, ducked under the blast shield, and sprinted toward the auxiliary comms unit. She knew what was there. Knew what the military would want to protect. And she also knew they wouldn't make it in time. The door to the shack was ajar, swinging like a pendulum in the wind. Inside, a young lieutenant bled out on the floor, a piece of metal embedded in his thigh. He looked up, dazed, reaching weakly for the radio. Rowan didn't hesitate. She ripped her shirt, wrapped the wound, pulled the emergency transmitter from the case, and began dialing the codes manually. Static hissed through the speakers. She didn't flinch. She adjusted the frequency, hardwired the backup antenna, and routed power from her own field kit. A moment later, the red light turned green. Transmission restored. Somewhere in Nevada, a satellite blinked to life. Command, this is Ridge. Status critical. Coordinates transmitting now. Repeat, base compromised. Multiple wounded. Request immediate aerial recon and evac. Repeat, this is Ridge. Her voice cut out as the second blast rocked the far fence. Glass shattered. She shielded the lieutenant with her own body. Dust filled the air again, choking and hot. When it cleared, the generator behind the depot was gone. Gone. Like it had never existed. Just a crater and fire. Rowan stood slowly, blood on her forearms, the smell of smoke in her hair. The radio was still transmitting. She'd done her part. She looked at the lieutenant. He was still breathing. Barely. You're gonna be fine, she said, her voice low, calm. She said it like it was a promise, not a hope. And in that moment, he believed her. Back at the medical bay, soldiers scrambled. Stretchers lined the walls. Triage tags were taped to foreheads, boots, uniforms. Rowan slipped in through the back. No one questioned her. Not because they knew who she was, but because she moved like someone who belonged. She helped where she could, patching, lifting, stabilizing. Her hands never shook. Not even when a corporal coded out in front of her, pupils wide, lips blue. She closed his eyes without a word and kept moving. Hours later, as dusk fell over Desert Ridge, the worst had passed. Emergency teams arrived. The fires were under control. The base was battered but intact. The death toll was lower than expected. And word had begun to spread. Someone in maintenance had restored the comms relay before the explosion. No one knew who. The command team assumed it had been one of their own. An officer, maybe? Or a seasoned comms specialist? No one guessed it had been the quiet woman who usually repaired generators. Not until someone mentioned a name. Rowan. Just Rowan. A tech. A contractor. Civilian. And then something strange happened. The rumor grew. From tech to operator. From operator to ghost. I saw her take a hit and keep moving, someone said. She bypassed the lockout manually, said another. She knew the codes. By the next morning, her name was everywhere. Whispers, mostly. Murmurs in the chow line. Glances in the hallway. The base had never really seen her before. Now they couldn't look away. She felt it. The shift. And she didn't like it. Not because she feared exposure, but because it meant her cover, the quiet life, the invisibility she had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to fracture. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She just went back to work. The next morning, she walked into the communications room to find her name crossed off the shift roster. A new name had been scribbled over it in red marker, marked not cleared. It was a small thing, easily overlooked by anyone else. But Rowan knew better. This wasn't a mistake. This was sabotage. This was a message. But Rowan didn't flinch. She simply moved on, bypassing the restricted areas, finding her own way to do the job that no one else could do. She wasn't angry. She was accustomed to this. The isolation, the sabotage, the constant feeling of being erased, it was all part of the life she had come to accept. What she didn't expect, though, was for the sabotage to intensify. That afternoon, she arrived at the calibration room to work on a failed power module, only to find her contractor badge blinking red at the scanner. The automated voice chirped restricted area. Clearance pending verification. Rowan swiped it again, but the system rejected it once more. She glanced up at the technician manning the desk, a young sergeant who looked about as confused as she felt. Sorry, ma'am, the sergeant said, his voice apologetic. New system protocol. You'll need to get reauthorized through section security. Rowan didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply turned and walked out, feeling the eyes of the room on her as she did. She knew what was happening. They were trying to box her in, trying to force her out. They were pushing her toward a corner where she could no longer escape. The next day, it happened again. Her toolbox, which she had locked up carefully the night before, was found open. Her tools had been untouched, but they had been rearranged, moved, not carelessly, but intentionally. The torque wrench was shifted precisely 2 inches out of place. The voltmeter was flipped upside down. Her notes had been reversed as if someone had gone through them. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had been looking for something. Not just sabotage anymore. It was a hunt. For her past. For who she really was. Later that evening, in the base's administrative wing, Corporal Diaz stood outside the personnel office, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he stared at the door. Inside, he knew, sat someone with the clearance to make things move, slowly or swiftly, and Diaz had a decision to make. He wasn't here on official duty. No orders. No requests. Just a suspicion that had been gnawing at him since the day Rowan's back tattoo had been revealed during a routine medical check. It hadn't meant much at first, just an unusual ink pattern, barely visible beneath the edge of her shirt. But something about it, the angle, the symbolism, the stark lines of the crimson lightning bolt, it stuck with him. He'd seen it before. Not in a manual. Not in training. But in a briefing years ago, classified, blacked out, so secret even the name had been redacted. They had called it Crimson 17. And the file hadn't been about heroism, it had been about disappearance, destruction, erasure. Everyone had died. Or so they said. And now Rowan Hale, a civilian, a contractor with no listed history, had the same tattoo. As soon as his superior stepped out for coffee, Diaz slipped into the room and left a folded envelope on the desk. Inside was a printed report, screenshots of Rowan's badge photo, timestamps from her system login history, and a typed memo with blunt language. Civilian contractor Rowan Hale has bypassed multiple access protocols restricted to former military personnel. Recommend verification of service history. Behavior indicates potential impersonation or unsanctioned field experience. Request formal inquiry. Diaz hesitated only briefly before sliding it under the corner of a comms folder. He didn't know if it was the right thing to do. But something about Rowan unsettled him. She was more than she claimed to be, and he didn't trust what he didn't understand. The inquiry arrived faster than Rowan expected. Within 24 hours, she was summoned to the personnel office in the East Wing. The email marked urgent, with no further details. The waiting room was as sterile as an operating room. White walls, plastic chairs, the faint antiseptic tang of bureaucracy. She sat, quiet, as a thin, nervous man in a civilian suit walked in holding a clipboard. His badge read Lewis, and he spoke like someone trained to be polite but not trained to deal with real people. "Miss Hale?" he asked, hesitating as if unsure whether to call her Miss, Mrs., or something else entirely. "We just need you to review and update your file. Routine data sync. Database overhaul. Real pain in the neck. Nothing serious." His smile was rehearsed. Rowan took the clipboard without a word and scanned the document. Most of it was standard, name, DOB, contractor status. But the bottom section stood out. It asked for her military service history. For options: active duty, reserve, never served, other. Her eyes lingered on the form longer than necessary. She hovered her pen over the boxes, then finally marked other. Lewis raised an eyebrow. "Would you mind elaborating?" he asked, tapping something into his tablet. She said nothing. He continued anyway. "Just a second while I verify your clearance through the updated system." His fingers flew over the screen, but then stopped. His expression shifted from polite to confused. "Ha!" he muttered. "Your file. It's been flagged." He scrolled again, frowning. "It says your clearance is current, but your military records, they're blank." He looked up, apologetic but unnerved. "No DD-214, no MOS, no record of enlistment, discharge, nothing." Rowan said nothing. She already knew. Someone had erased her. Someone had gone into the military system and scrubbed her history clean. Not just redacted it, deleted it, like she had never existed. The next morning, whispers turned into something more dangerous. The fear that had once been a quiet buzz around Rowan's presence became sharp and loud. She was no longer just an outsider, she was a threat. Soldiers stopped talking when she passed. Officers stared too long. Files were reviewed. Keys were changed. She was being boxed in. But not for discipline. Not for punishment. For containment. For control. And yet, Rowan moved through it all with silence. She never raised her voice. Never confronted anyone. She worked. Ate alone. Slept in the back wing of the mechanical shed. She was invisible. But she was done pretending. The shift came during a mandatory training session, a maintenance refresher briefing that every enlisted soldier had to attend quarterly. Usually, these were led by junior engineers, full of dry jargon and slow PowerPoint slides. But this time, Rowan was at the front of the room. She wore her standard jumpsuit, zipped high, her boots polished to a dull shine. She held a clipboard in one hand, a projector remote in the other. No one expected much, until the screen behind her flickered to life, revealing a schematic of the GenPower 9A generator, a prototype system only seen in combat zones. The room quieted. "Today," Rowan began, her voice steady, "we're reviewing emergency redistribution protocols for grid compromise scenarios." A few soldiers glanced at each other. This wasn't standard procedure. "This system," she continued, pointing to the core relay, "can fail under heat or impact conditions. When that happens, you bypass the failsafes and reroute current manually through this junction." One of the sergeants raised his hand. "That sequence isn't in the handbook." Rowan didn't flinch. "No, it's not. Crimson 17 wrote it. In Al-Hudra, after we lost 4 men to a power collapse under fire." The silence that followed was absolute. The room froze. Rowan stepped forward, her voice sharp now. "You don't have to believe me, but if the backup grid fails."
"During a breach, and you're in the field, this," she pointed again, "fast, clean, efficient, will keep you alive. I'm not teaching theory. I'm teaching survival." Sergeant Riggs from engineering stood slowly. "Wait. You're saying you were—" "Yes," Rowan said. "I was the convoy engineer for Crimson 17. The air left the room in a vacuum. No one moved. No one spoke. Rowan took a breath and, with calm precision, unzipped the top of her jumpsuit just enough to expose the edge of the tattoo. The skeletal mask, the broken sword, the jagged bolts. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some stood. Others stepped back like they'd seen a ghost. Because they had. The woman who wasn't supposed to exist. Who had been buried in reports. who had dragged half-dead men through burning vehicles and vanished into classified silence. She was standing in front of them. Before anyone could speak, the door creaked open. Footsteps echoed against the concrete. Everyone turned as Major General Decker entered. He walked to the front, alone, his face unreadable. He looked at Rowan like he was seeing her for the first time. "You said you weren't here to be found," he said quietly. Rowan met his eyes, unflinching. "I never pretended to be invisible," she said. "You did that for me." The words hit like shrapnel. Decker's expression cracked. He had buried her. He had buried them all. And now the truth stood before him, alive, scarred and speaking. The room remained frozen as the soldiers processed what had just unfolded. Some would forget. Some would deny. But most would never look at Rowan the same way again. Respect doesn't come from stories. It comes from survival. And survival, Rowan had in spades. After the confrontation in the briefing room, the silence didn't end when Rowan zipped her jumpsuit back up or when Major General Decker left the room without another word. It lingered, thick and charged, long after the soldiers filed out in uneasy silence. No one laughed. No one jeered. Not even Diaz. The same man who had filed the anonymous report now kept his head down as he passed her in the hallway later that day. He didn't say a word, but his eyes flickered for a moment, and in that flicker was the uneasy burn of shame. Rowan didn't stop him. She didn't need to. The reckoning had already started. She had no need for confrontation. What she needed was clarity, and that finally was beginning to surface, not through chaos, but through the subtle rearrangement of power. By the next morning, the mood across Desert Ridge had shifted in ways too quiet for command to officially acknowledge, but too obvious to ignore. She no longer found tools mysteriously moved in her box. Her locker was no longer mysteriously left open. Her name, once scratched out in red marker on the shift roster, now appeared again in clean, black print, crisp, untouched, official. No one said who put it there, but it was back. That alone was enough. There were still stares, yes, and whispers that slid between mess hall tables like oil, but they no longer dripped with mockery or suspicion. Now they came tinged with curiosity, maybe even guilt. And beneath that, respect. It started with small things. A soldier from Power Systems left his seat empty next to Rowan during a systems calibration exercise. No words. Just the seat, there for her, unclaimed by anyone else. Later that day, another technician handed her a spare thermal coupler without being asked. She nodded, he nodded. That was all. But it was enough. These weren't apologies. They weren't declarations. They were acknowledgments, quiet signals that they now saw her, not as a contractor, not as a ghost, but as one of their own. Major General Decker, meanwhile, was not doing well with the truth. Not publicly. Publicly, he was composed, firm, professional. But behind closed doors, he paced his office like a man haunted. Rowan's face was a shadow he couldn't escape. She had been there, on that night in Al-Hudra, dragging him out of the burning wreckage with arms slicked in her own blood and his. He had barely been conscious, and when the evac came, they told him she hadn't made it. That none of them had. And he had signed it. The reports. The death certificates. The closure papers. All of it. He had buried the unit with a stroke of a pen. But she had survived. And no one had told him. Or maybe someone had, and that was worse. Decker's guilt wasn't performative. It was quiet. Slow burning. He didn't summon Rowan. He didn't call a meeting. Instead, he walked the length of the base late at night when no one was around, eyes lingering on the mechanical wing where she still worked past curfew. He watched her from a distance, never speaking. And each time he turned away. Rowan, for her part, wasn't interested in what came next from command. She had no illusions. A tattoo and a whispered confession in a briefing room didn't undo 10 years of erasure. She didn't expect medals. She didn't expect justice. She just wanted to work, to be left alone, finally, with her tools and silence. But that, of course, wasn't what happened. A week later, a new shipment of generator cores arrived from off-base, heavier, more dangerous, more advanced than anything the current staff had ever dealt with. A new technical order was issued: recalibrate all diagnostics and testing parameters. The core's internal feedback systems were fragile. One mistake, and the thing would short, or worse, explode. And the only person who had worked with this model in a live field environment was Rowan. Word traveled fast. And by the next morning, every technician in Desert Ridge's power division stood quietly in formation in Hangar 3, waiting for her to walk them through it. She didn't make a speech. She didn't posture. She just rolled up her sleeves and got to work, explaining the grounding harness sequence like she was threading a memory. Sharp, efficient, lived.
She had been there on that night in Al-Hudra, dragging him out of the burning wreckage with arms slicked in her own blood and his. He had barely been conscious, and when the evac came, they told him she hadn't made it. That none of them had. And he had signed it. The reports. The death certificates. The closure papers. All of it. He had buried the unit with a stroke of a pen. But she had survived. And no one had told him. Or maybe someone had, and that was worse. Decker's guilt wasn't performative. It was quiet. Slow-burning. He didn't summon Rowan. He didn't call a meeting. Instead, he walked the length of the base late at night when no one was around, eyes lingering on the mechanical wing where she still worked past curfew. He watched her from a distance, never speaking. And each time he turned away. Rowan, for her part, wasn't interested in what came next from command. She had no illusions. A tattoo and a whispered confession in a briefing room didn't undo 10 years of erasure. She didn't expect medals. She didn't expect justice. She just wanted to work, to be left alone, finally, with her tools and silence. But that, of course, wasn't what happened. A week later, a new shipment of generator cores arrived from off-base, heavier, more dangerous, more advanced than anything the current staff had ever dealt with. A new technical order was issued: recalibrate all diagnostics and testing parameters. The core's internal feedback systems were fragile. One mistake and the thing would short or worse, explode. And the only person who had worked with this model in a live field environment was Rowan. Word traveled fast. And by the next morning, every technician in Desert Ridge's power division stood quietly in formation in Hangar 3, waiting for her to walk them through it. She didn't make a speech. She didn't posture. She just rolled up her sleeves and got to work explaining the grounding harness sequence like she was threading a memory. Sharp, efficient, lived. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. And this time, when she finished, no one questioned her. Even Diaz. Especially Diaz. He stood to the side, his face unreadable, arms crossed, but when she gave the final instruction, he stepped forward and said, not loudly but clearly enough, "What about during heat shifts in high-altitude conditions?" Rowan didn't blink. "You recalibrate in real time. Feedback offsets at 0.6. Anything higher, you shut the system down." Diaz nodded. That was it. But it was the first time he had spoken to her with something other than suspicion. That mattered. Later that day, Rowan returned to her bench in the tool shed and found something waiting for her. A voltage meter, not new, but cleaned, rethreaded, fully functional. It had once been hers. She had tossed it in frustration after someone had tampered with it weeks ago, shorting the internal battery and rendering it useless. No one had admitted to the sabotage. But someone had repaired it. There was no note. No words. Just the tool. Restored. It sat in the center of her workbench like a silent apology. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and placed it back in her box. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. But her fingers lingered on it longer than necessary. That night, the mess hall felt different. People didn't avoid her anymore. They didn't sit next to her either, not yet. But the tension was gone. Replaced by a space. A breathing room. Like the base was beginning to recalibrate around her. Respect doesn't come quickly. It's not a wave. It's a slow tide. But the current had shifted. And everyone felt it. The real change came the following week when a transport convoy broke down 5 miles outside the perimeter. Sandstorm incoming, visibility 0. Communications down. They needed emergency power rerouted to navigation systems or the convoy would drift into a minefield. The response team scrambled. Rowan was not on the call list. But the lead engineer, Riggs, overrode the dispatch and called for her directly. When Rowan arrived at the outpost junction, the sand whipping against her goggles and the convoy blinking like ghosts in the distance, no one hesitated. They handed her the schematics, the cables, the insulated gloves. And she didn't wait. She waded into the storm with the confidence of someone who had seen worse and survived. She was under the lead truck in minutes, rerouting current, stabilizing the signal repeater, bypassing 2 faulted capacitors like she had built the damn thing herself. And when the lights snapped on in the final transport vehicle, a cheer went up over the radio. Not loud, not celebratory, just one word, stabilized. Back at base, Decker sat in his office staring at the transmission logs. Her name was on every line. Rowan Hale, once a ghost, now a name spoken without fear. Rowan didn't return to the command office after the convoy incident. There was no debrief, no medals, no formal congratulations, just silence. But the kind that hummed, a different silence than before. Not the cold indifference of people trying to erase you. This one had gravity, a weight. People saw her now. They didn't know how to deal with it, not fully. But it was there in the way they moved around her. Slower, less dismissive. She walked the halls of Desert Ridge like someone carved into the infrastructure. A presence that couldn't be painted over or ignored. She was the proof of a truth they had all silently accepted for years. That some ghosts don't stay buried. The small signs continued. One morning, her station in the diagnostics bay had been upgraded, not officially, but the changes were there. New soldering tools. A working calibration dock. Her worn-down stool replaced with a padded seat she hadn't requested. The ventilation was finally fixed. It was all unofficial. No orders. No requisitions filed. But someone had done it. A quiet offering. A peace gesture from a system that had once tried to wipe her out. The younger soldiers watched her differently now. They didn't speak often, but they observed. Eyes lingering longer, questions forming but unasked for now. Rowan caught them sometimes, trailing behind her during system tests, pretending to calibrate their own equipment. She didn't call them out. Let them watch, she thought. Let them learn what isn't written in the manuals. Major General Decker, meanwhile, had started making visits to the technical bays. Never long, never directly to her, but always hovering close, asking general questions to the tech crew, inspecting reports he didn't usually care about. Rowan knew what he was doing. Trying to make peace with a ghost. But ghosts don't make it easy. Not the kind she had become. The past hadn't finished with her either. One afternoon, Rowan received a secure message routed through an old system node. One that wasn't connected to the main command network. It was an outdated relay protocol only used in field ops during blackout conditions. Most soldiers wouldn't even recognize it. But Rowan did. The message was short. Just a string of numbers. Coordinates, and a single word, echo. Her chest tightened. Crimson 17 had used codenames like that. Not in training, not in briefings, only in live combat, during missions where no backup was coming and no one was supposed to survive. Rowan stared at the message for a long time, her fingers trembling as she shut the console off and erased the log manually. No trace, no trail. Just the echo of something she'd buried years ago clawing back into her present. That night, sleep didn't come. Her dreams were thick with the heat of burning deserts. Convoys ripped open by fire. The smell of oil and blood and metal. A quiet offering. A peace gesture from a system that had once tried to wipe her out. The younger soldiers watched her differently now. They didn't speak often, but they observed. Eyes lingering longer, questions forming but unasked for now. Rowan caught them sometimes, trailing behind her during system tests, pretending to calibrate their own equipment. She didn't call them out. Let them watch, she thought. Let them learn what isn't written in the manuals. Major General Decker, meanwhile, had started making visits to the technical bays. Never long, never directly to her, but always hovering close, asking general questions to the tech crew, inspecting reports he didn't usually care about. Rowan knew what he was doing. Trying to make peace with a ghost. But ghosts don't make it easy. Not the kind she had become. The past hadn't finished with her either. One afternoon, Rowan received a secure message routed through an old system node. One that wasn't connected to the main command network. It was an outdated relay protocol only used in field ops during blackout conditions. Most soldiers wouldn't even recognize it. But Rowan did. The message was short. Just a string of numbers. Coordinates, and a single word, echo. Her chest tightened. Crimson 17 had used codenames like that. Not in training, not in briefings, only in live combat, during missions where no backup was coming and no one was supposed to survive. Rowan stared at the message for a long time, her fingers trembling as she shut the console off and erased the log manually. No trace, no trail. just the echo of something she'd buried years ago clawing back into her present. That night, sleep didn't come. Her dreams were thick with the heat of burning deserts, convoys ripped open by fire, the smell of oil and blood and metal. Faces flashed behind her eyelids, her team, laughing in one moment, screaming in the next. She woke drenched in sweat, her lungs aching like she'd been running for hours. The echo wouldn't go away. By morning, she was back in the West Hangar, running diagnostics on the new power grid modules, but her mind wasn't in it. Not fully. The numbers blurred. Her movements slowed. Sergeant Riggs noticed. He didn't ask. He just handed her a water bottle and muttered, "You look like hell, Hale." She smirked weakly, muttered something back, and went on with her work. But her thoughts were already on the old node. Who had sent that message? Why now? Later that day, she returned to the relay terminal, isolated, buried in the lower level of the maintenance wing. She keyed in a private encryption string, one no one should have known. The system lit green. And then, after a long pause, the terminal blinked to life again with another message. Still breathing. Reconvene at Dust Point. We need you.
No signature.
Just another part of the ghost trail pulling her in. Rowan leaned against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. Dust Point was an abandoned listening station 3 clicks outside the perimeter, officially decommissioned after the Al-Hudra mission. Unofficially, it had been one of Crimson 17's fallback points, a place where things were hidden when the mission went sideways. If someone was using it now, it meant more than just memory. It meant survival. It meant someone else had lived. She didn't tell anyone. She couldn't. The military still officially listed everyone from Crimson 17 as dead. Talking about it would trigger inquiries she couldn't afford. So she waited, watched, bided her time, and one evening, just before midnight, she slipped out of Desert Ridge on foot, walking into the black of the desert with nothing but her toolkit, her jacket, and a loaded flashlight. Faces flashed behind her eyelids, her team, laughing in one moment, screaming in the next. She woke drenched in sweat, her lungs aching like she'd been running for hours. The echo wouldn't go away. By morning, she was back in the West Hangar, running diagnostics on the new power grid modules, but her mind wasn't in it. Not fully. The numbers blurred. Her movements slowed. Sergeant Riggs noticed. He didn't ask. He just handed her a water bottle and muttered, "You look like hell, Hale." She smirked weakly, muttered something back, and went on with her work. But her thoughts were already on the old node. Who had sent that message? Why now? Later that day, she returned to the relay terminal, isolated, buried in the lower level of the maintenance wing. She keyed in a private encryption string, one no one should have known. The system lit green. And then, after a long pause, the terminal blinked to life again with another message. Still breathing. Reconvene at Dust Point. We need you.
No signature.
Just another part of the ghost trail pulling her in. Rowan leaned against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. Dust Point was an abandoned listening station 3 clicks outside the perimeter, officially decommissioned after the Al-Hudra mission. Unofficially, it had been one of Crimson 17's fallback points, a place where things were hidden when the mission went sideways. If someone was using it now, it meant more than just memory. It meant survival. It meant someone else had lived. She didn't tell anyone. She couldn't. The military still officially listed everyone from Crimson 17 as dead. Talking about it would trigger inquiries she couldn't afford. So she waited, watched, bided her time, and one evening, just before midnight, she slipped out of Desert Ridge on foot, walking into the black of the desert with nothing but her toolkit, her jacket, and a loaded flashlight. Dust Point was still there, hollow, silent, buried in the sand. The wind howled like it remembered what had happened here. Rowan ducked through the broken frame of the comms tower, moving past rusted consoles and gutted monitors until she reached the safe compartment behind the far wall. The lock had been reset. Only one code would work. She punched it in, a sequence from the old convoy manifest. The door slid open. Inside, lit only by the glow of a salvaged battery lamp, stood a man she hadn't seen in a decade. His hair was thinner, his face more drawn, but the eyes were the same, sharp, dark, burned by war. He didn't speak. Neither did she. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two ghosts staring across the threshold of survival. Then he spoke. I figured you'd come. Rowan stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. You shouldn't have reached out. He nodded. I know, but I didn't have a choice. They sat across from each other at a cracked metal table, the air between them heavy with memory. His name was Callan, Crimson 17's forward recon. He had been the first to go dark after the mission collapse. Everyone assumed he had been killed in the first wave. But here he was, alive, ragged, but breathing. Others? She asked. He shook his head slowly. Maybe, but I haven't seen them. Not since the tunnel collapse. I stayed off the grid. But something's changing, Rowan. Someone's digging. Her eyes narrowed. Digging what? Callan leaned forward. Not just you. Not just me. The whole mission. The cover-up. Someone's trying to bring it all back to the surface. And if they do, it's not just about the truth. It's about what we were protecting. Rowan felt her stomach twist. They were never supposed to find the black site. They're close, he said. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Then Rowan stood. We can't do this alone. Callan nodded. Then we find the ones who are left. Rowan walked out into the night. Her eyes were focused now. Cold. Determined. The past had come knocking again, not with fire this time, but with quiet urgency. And she was ready. Not to run, but to return. Rowan returned to Desert Ridge just before dawn, her boots dusted with desert sand and her pulse slower than it should have been. She hadn't slept. Not really. Just kept moving. She bypassed the front gates using the technician tunnel beneath the old substation, one of the many shortcuts she'd mapped long ago when no one had trusted her to be anywhere without supervision. The guards didn't notice her slip in, or maybe they pretended not to. Either way, she was inside before the sky began to color. Before the base started to stir. She walked the halls like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't seen a ghost. Like she hadn't sat face to face with a man the military had declared dead and learned that the cover-up of Crimson 17 was unraveling faster than anyone could control. The morning shift barely looked at her. A few nods. A few tired greetings. Nothing unusual. But to Rowan, everything had changed. She made her way to the systems bay and booted up the diagnostics console. Her fingers moved automatically, tapping through screens of data that blurred together. Nothing seemed urgent anymore. Not compared to what was coming. If someone was looking for the black site, the real one buried beneath the layers of the Al-Hudra operation, then time was running out. That place hadn't just housed weapons. It held something else. Something even Rowan hadn't been cleared to fully understand. All she knew was that Crimson 17 was assigned to protect it not just with guns and tech, but with their lives and their silence. Her silence had lasted years, but now it felt brittle. Sergeant Riggs showed up 2 hours later, rubbing his temples like the caffeine hadn't hit him yet. We've got a feedback fault in Zone 7, he muttered, dropping a report on her desk. Your name's already on the assignment. Rowan took it without a word. Routine. Necessary. She needed the routine to stay unnoticed a little longer. But Riggs lingered, watching her more closely than usual. You good? He asked finally, like the question had taken effort. Rowan nodded once. I'm fine. He didn't push. Just shrugged and walked off. But she could feel it, eyes on her. The change in the air. The slow unraveling of the secrecy she'd wrapped around herself like armor. Later that day, in the hangar, she heard whispers. Not the usual careless chatter of soldiers, but the kind of quiet meant to carry between the right ears. Tattoo's real. She's the one from Al-Hudra. I heard she saved Decker's life. Ghosts don't walk unless something's wrong. She kept moving. But the real shift came during the evening systems drill. Rowan had been asked quietly without fanfare to lead the emergency override protocol training for the new recruits. Nothing unusual. She'd done it before. But this time, the briefing room was packed, shoulder to shoulder, not just with privates, but with sergeants and engineers, even officers from communications. People who didn't need to be there. People who chose to be. The lights dimmed. The projector flickered to life. Rowan stepped into the center of the room. She didn't use a pointer. Didn't raise her voice. She just spoke. If your comms black out during a system breach and you can't route through the mainframe, you don't panic. You isolate the manual nodes. You prioritize power to life support and water filtration. And you remember this. She tapped the screen.